Conman Gamer here, bringing you another video for Remembrance. Chapter 6 of the World War I book, Truce. Chapter 6. The lull is finished. Black at headquarters, General Lawrence Smith Durn had been receiving doubting reports all day about things going on at the front. Fighting had all but grounded to a halt, and the opposing armies were having friendly meetings to no man's land. Smith Durn fired off an angry message to his commanders. I have issued the strictest orders that on no account is fraternization to be allowed between the opposing troops. To finish this war quickly, we must keep up the fighting spirit and do all we can to discourage friendly meetings, because Smith Dorn had also heard that some officers were actually influenced the truth. He issued honor warning. I am calling for petitions as to names of officers' units who took part in this Christmas gathering, with a view to display action. The commander of all British troops, Field Marshal John French, leads just and angry. When this frustration was reported to me, I issued immediate orders to refute any assurance of conduct, and called the local commanders to strict account, which resulted in a good deal of trouble. The German High Command took much the same view and issued a third order. Commander's Second Army directed the information entering with enemy are to cease. Officers allowing them are to be brought before a court-martial. In the same area, these orders have immediate result. The British private Bernard Brooks was standing guard at midnight at December 25th with artillery sent over for the small colonel to let them know the truth at Richwood. World would wonder was explained, in this place death and bloodshed but once again regained supreme. The Germans encountered with artillery barrage of their own. Despite the using of officers to fire on the enemy, many soldiers on both sides were willing to give up the peace. Some simply didn't fire at the enemy. British Private William Tapp related that opposing troops were still meeting in no man's land as the sun came up December 26th. It's too ridiculous for words, he noted. We all are mixed up again. At 9 o'clock that morning, the Allied commanding officer ordered an artillery duel. Top gunner his report. Shells are exchanged for a few hours, but every so often we stand up, no fear of being shot with a bullet. Another spot in the line, two opposing officers met. The German informed his British counterpart that his colonel had given orders for a renewal of hostilities at midday, and might the men be warned to keep down, please. The British officer thanked him for the warning and returned to his trench. Then, just before the shooting was to start, a tin was thrown into the British trench with a message that read, "We shoot to the air," and sure enough, the English regiment's history records At the appointed hour, a few bird shots were fired high over the trenches. Then all was quiet again. Then unfurled truce continued. On the German side, resistance to resuming the fighting was even stronger. One British unit war diary states simply that the Germans throughout the morning appeared to have no intention of opening fire on us. In another section, the order to fire on the British nearly caused a mutiny. When the order was given, a German officer told Ethel Cooper years later, the men struck. The officers stormed up and down, got as the only result the answer, "We can't. There are good fellows, and we can't." Finally, the officers threatened the men with fire or we do, and not at the enemy. Not a shot had come from the other side, but at last we fired, and answering fire came back, but not a man fell. We spent the day and the next wasting ammunition and trying to shoot the stars down on the sky. There was some attempts to restart the war. Following Christmas, several small raids were launched, and the artillery on both sides sent shells screaming through the air. Even so, many of the men still managed to arrange a number of international truces on New Year's Eve and New Year's Day. These truces did not involve nearly as many men as those at Christmas. In addition to the raids and shelling, a good number of the units on both sides that had taken part in the first truce were resigned to other sections of the battlefield. The seemed opposition was gotten to know and like one another, despite Andrew's movement back to fighting. Some areas of gotten to know another. Despite Andrew's movement, fighting areas held on their truce for as long as possible. In Berlin Wood and Belgium, for instance, little hard fighting took place until early spring. The truce continues. An amazed corporal noted in his diary, "Daring with the peace and goodwill idea on Christmas Day, it was found merely present, and on another side, keeping close watch, fires at shot. Following Christmas, the warm weather and rain returned. The terrible mud that held made their lives miserable before Christmas also reappeared." British Captain Mace Marshall thought the existing peace proposal sensible idea. There is no sniping, and the men on both sides stand up, repaired their paperettes, and wave to each other, and sometimes make each other tea. And almost generosity also it is sensible, as the useless and annoying sniping can have no effect on the progress of the campaign. A general friendship developed between the English and the German soldiers, and perilous would, because intervention by a high-ranking officer meant that men would have to demonstrate a fighting spirit by firing at the enemy. Both sides took on enforcing the order of such visits. Lieutenant J. D. Watt recalled the day when a message came down the line to say that the Germans expected that their general was coming along in the afternoon, so we better keep down, as they might have to do a little shooting to make things look right. And This is war. The peace in Persia lasted through March, and caused Captain Marshall to exclaim, "Isn't this an extraordinary sight of affairs? The Germans seem to get more friendly every day, and heaven knows how they will either ever start fighting again." Some comments were personally that the military commanders feared and proposed General House Smith Doran to wage war to the knife as the only way to carry on a campaign of this sort. By Easter the truce were all over. Artillery barrages became common again, and the snipers went out to do their methodical, deadly work. An editorial of the London Daily Mirror learned that the truce of events, but now an end of the truce. The news had and good begins again. 1915 darkness over again with who watched have to mourn many of our finest men. The lull is finished. The tragedy renewed themselves. There would be a few small isolated truce during Christmas 1915, but nothing at all like what happened this year or the year before. Anticipating that retaliation, the commanders of all armies issued strict warnings against such shows of friendship to further discern meetings in no man's land. The 1915 Christmas season was marked by Colonel Adderley Bergen's "The Great War would drag along for another 4 years. Many more disbelieving charges would be mounted, answered by just as many encouragers. All were aimed at breaking through the enemy line and destroying their will to fight. Very little territory was actually gained by each side during this time, and it seemed as if fighting would drag along for many more years. Everything changed when the United States entered the war against Germany, Austria, and their allies. In 1917, the United States lent money to the Allied countries and began sending them badly needed war supplies. Much more important, 3 million American troops would join the Allied soldiers in battle. Exhausted by war and German army, Emperor Charles I of Austria, who had become emperor in 1916 when his 85-year-old Kaiser William found himself faced with mutinies in both his armies and navy, political unrest at home, and ancient enemy, he abdicated his throne in November, and then Germany sued for peace. When the war finally ended in 1918, the front lines were remarkably similar to those that existed in 1914. The carriages and desolation were appalling. Over 8 million soldiers had been killed by bombardments, machine gun and rifle fire, poisonous gas, and disease. Another 6.5 million civilians also perished. Cities and villages were leveled, farms, factories blown to pieces. Where crops had once grown, endless lines of shrapnel or terraces now dotted the landscape. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers who served the war returned home with ghastly physical wounds. Many others suffered lifelong emotional damage from what they had witnessed and endured. The number of casualties was so high that by 1918 both sides, soldiers and civilians alike, were angry and vengeful, but not at their own political leaders for getting them into war under false pretenses, or at their military commanders for sickening with clearly outnumbered in deadly combat tactics. At the time, most people still believed their country's propaganda. Instead, they blamed their enemies for the slaughter and demanded justice. Charles I was banished from Austria and spent the rest of his life living in poverty on the islands of Madeira. After abdicating, Kaiser William went into exile in Holland. Two other emperors also fell apart as a result of the war. The Ottoman Empire was dissolved when it surrendered to the Allies in 1918 and eventually became the Republic of Turkey. In Russia, the Bolshevik Revolution and a British army forced Caesar Nicholas II to give up the throne in 1917, and the Union of Socialist Soviet Republics was created. The Caesar and his entire family were assassinated a year later, ending 300 years of imperial rule. In an effort to weaken Germany and ensuring a peaceful future, the Allies instructed that Germany and Austria give up territory to create a number of new and independent countries. Millions of Germans and Austrians suddenly found themselves being ruled by people they had formerly considered inferior to them. Germany came in for additional sanctions, which included surrendering all its overseas colonies and sharply reducing its military forces and equipment. It was also required to pay repercussions for the experience of damages caused by the war, plus pensions for the soldiers and widows of its enemies. As some historian Michael Orward noted, so huge that it could not even be completed. Finally, and possibly most galling to the Germans, they were required to admit that the war had been their fault alone. German representatives at the neighboring toasted the harsh terms, especially when it came to be known as the war guilt, caused by the army and judiciary and tens of thousands of citizens near starvation. They had no other choice but to agree to sign the Versailles Treaty. Far from breaking the German spirit, the treaty irritated the country's people and made them determined to regain their former power. These feelings eventually led the German people back into political extreme near Hitler and resulted 20 years later in World War II. How would history have been changed if Kaiser William had been less arrogant and aggressive, or how not engaged on Emperor Maximus Joseph? Could the First World War have been avoided if the Kaiser had only read the Serbian response to Austria-Hungary's ultimatum sooner? What might have happened if the war had been delayed long enough for the less warlike Charles I to take the Austrian throne? Many historians would brush aside questions as foolish. What if history agreed that Germany and Austria were determined to go to war to achieve their national goals, and the truth is that we have no idea whether or not the First World War could have been avoided if each country leader had been more willing to reserve rather than fight. But at least one future British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, did ask a historical question that bears thinking about. What would happen, he wondered, 1 month before the Christmas truce in 1914 if the army suddenly militarized and went on strike? British Private Albert Moon had an answer to the question. If the truce had gone on, there is no telling what could have happened. Moon replied it could have meant the end of the war after all. They didn't want another war, and we didn't want war, and it could have ended up by finishing the war altogether. Major Murdoch Mackenzie would have an even stronger opinion. Wood was in the trenches in 1914 and participated in a truce that lasted over 2 weeks. I came to the conclusion that I have firmly ever since that if we had been left to ourselves, there would have never been a word shot fired. For a fortnight that the truce went on, we often the most friendly terms, and it was only the fact that we ran into control by others that made it necessary for us to start trying to shoot one another again. After word of the truce reached England, the Herald newspaper's editor wrote that peace could win out, even if for a few days. It is especially saddening that the editorial claimed that the soldiers were not in charge of the affairs of Europe, instead of the diplomats were. If they were, we would have a neutral and human Europe. It's Common Gamer here. Please walk up to a veteran and say thank you and give them a job or give them a happy meal. This is Common Gamer signing off. Please comment, rate, and subscribe, and hit the like button.